Take it away, David.
All right, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Callier. Thank you guys for being here. Today I'll be presenting my thesis on AI and alternative data and lending, opportunities and challenges that this brings to regional and mid-sized banks. So table of contents, what we'll go over today. Start off with the current banking landscape. Then we'll take a look at traditional credit data and limitations. Then we'll start to understand alternative data, the challenges facing regional banks, future outlook, strategic pathways for adoption, a conclusion, and then we'll finish with time for questions. So first, I want to start off with why I chose this topic. I didn't decide on this topic until actually this semester, even after a whole semester of thesis prep. And that was because I had a summer internship over at Comerica Bank. It's a bank headquartered in Dallas, Texas. And during that time, I was able to learn a lot about the underwriting process, some of the systems and regulations that go into that, as well as the relationship side to banking. That's really important in that aspect, and being able to understand your customers, know their needs, and provide what's best for them when it comes to credit. So it made me think about how banks can start to grow in this sort of new technologically advanced environment with things like AI. I was able to learn about alternative data, which is really supplemental and helpful to those AI underwriting models and that growth of banks in this new age. So we'll take a look at the current banking landscape. Right now, we're in a landscape of pretty overall economic uncertainty, as well as increased competition amongst banks. We've seen fintech firms, for example, with really high growth rates and high expansion recently, compared to some of the regional banks where we've seen drop-offs and consolidations. When we look at interest rates, we've seen that we're at a heightened stage between 3.75% and 4%, compared to the Fed's target of 2%. Additionally, if we look at this graph, we can see delinquency rates, which is the percentage of people that aren't paying off credit. That can lead to further issues for banks. And so we see that compared to many years before, we're at a better stage, but post-pandemic levels have been increasing. And so that shows that increase in risk within the credit sector. So where do regional banks stand in all of this? Regional banks are sort of at a middle ground between big banks and community banks, as well as those small but fast-growing fintech banking firms. Regional banks are defined as banks between $10 billion and $100 billion in assets, and they have that feel of a community bank and that relationship aspect. They also have the capital needs and abilities of a lot of these bigger banks. And so looking at the KBW NASDAQ Regional Banking Index, which essentially tracks a number of stocks of different regional banks, we can see a 4.72% year-to-date drop compared to almost a 16% gain in the overall banking industry when looking at the KBW NASDAQ Bank Index. So that just shows that regional banks at this time are struggling. We're seeing consolidations of 52 banks, 52 deals worth over $16.6 billion. Most notably, my bank where I interned at, Comerica, was acquired in a $10.9 billion all-stock acquisition, and that'll go through in 2026. But they were bought out by another bigger regional bank, and so it just goes to show how competitive this market is becoming, especially for regional banks at this time. So now I'll get into sort of the traditional consumer lending aspect. There's a lot of moving parts within this sector or this area. First of all, we have credit bureaus. So these are companies like Equifax, Experian, TransUnion. They bring together a bunch of information about consumers that's collected, it's relevant to credit, and that's then used by a lot of these credit scoring companies like FICO, Vantage Score, and those bring those pieces of data together into a single number that predicts how likely borrower is going to be able to repay. And then banks and all of this, they take information from the bureaus, they take information from credit scoring models, and then they take their own underwriting processes through information like debt to income of people that are lending with the banks, and ultimately they're able to come to this decision of whether or not to originate a loan, to approve or deny someone for different loans. So that's sort of the traditional credit consumer area right now. When we look at limitations to traditional lending, First, we can see limitations with visibility. So credit scores are not always going to be able to reflect ability to pay because they are so backwards looking. For example, if someone has a late payment, that affects their credit score, and that in part is going to affect how a bank is going to see them, and overall the information that they're taking in is going to be impacted. And so it's really important to look forward and look at current times, look at cash flows, current income, and that's something that's really limited in these traditional consumer lending models. Secondly, outdated underwriting processes. The processes of regional banks now, a lot slower, more manual inputs. And this is a lot more inefficient compared to some of these fintech firms that are able to grow their technology, their AI capabilities in underwriting, and use different sources of data, which is why they're able to expand so fast. And then lastly, structural exclusion. So people who are credit invisible or don't have credit scores, as well as those with thin files who don't have enough credit history to be scored accurately, are not able to be seen under traditional consumer lending models, and so that can be problematic. These people aren't going to have as much or as good access to credit, and it's also going to harm the potential revenue that banks are able to bring in using these traditional consumer lending models. So that brings me to what exactly is alternative data. So alternative data is defined as non-traditional information that's used to evaluate creditworthiness. This can be a variety of things like cash flows, which comes from someone's income and how much they're spending in real time, bank transaction history, payment history, sometimes even social media data. There's a bunch of these different numbers and metrics that are able to be measured and able to be used that aren't currently being accounted for in a lot of traditional consumer lending, especially for these mid-sized regional banks. This is not meant to replace credit scores, it's meant to supplement them. It's meant to be another way for banks to look at increased data and to be more efficient and effective in the ways that they're lending out to consumers. So why alternative data? If you look at this graph from the Consumer Federal Protection Bureau, it's for 2020, we can see that 12.5% of US consumers don't have a record or unscored. That 2.7% equates to 7 million people that have no credit record, and so that's going to make it extremely difficult for them to receive any sort of lending from banks or credit, as well as this 9.8%, which is about 25 million US customers who either have stale files, so this could be people that are from a older generation or people that aren't currently using credit as much. They might be using more debits, as well as people that are, the insufficient files refers to maybe younger people, immigrants, people that don't really have that much data just yet. And so with alternative data, we'd be able to lend to unscorable people and be more accurate in this and more efficient essentially. So Atlas Credit, for example, they worked with Experian, which is a credit bureau, and they were able to create an alternative credit risk data model, and that nearly doubled approvals and was able to reduce risk by 15 to 20%. So ultimately, alternative data is a really strong point that banks can use to have a competitive advantage. So now for some challenges that are facing regional banks as they try to shift towards that use of alternative data. First thing we have is capital and cost constraints. Obviously, the adoption of new technologies, AI underwriting, new data sources is going to cost money. And for a lot of these banks, they're working on old core legacy systems, which means they're going to need a total revamp and bringing on a whole bunch of new technologies, which costs a lot. Additionally, like many other banks, regional banks are going to have to hold capital against loans on their balance sheets. And a lot of these regulations are going to require a certain amount that makes it difficult to invest further into new technologies. And it really just limits that capital even more, especially compared to fintechs, which technically aren't often considered banks in the sense that they'll often sell loans that they originate to investors or other banks so that they have more money for technological innovation, and they're not put to those same constraints of regulatory capital. And then looking at some technological limitations, according to Accenture, which is a consulting and IT company, legacy infrastructure was 3.4 out of 4 as a barrier to cloud strategy execution for banks. This cloud strategy is essentially a network that allows for remote servers to process data rather than having a local server or personal computer. So that's really important when you're bringing on a bunch of this alternative data, large data sets that are big and unstructured. And as we can see, a lot of banks today, especially regional banks, operate on very old core legacy systems, 10 or more years older. And so that makes it difficult to bring on AI underwriting or to bring in other data because they're using such old systems that aren't able to process that at the same rate as maybe some of these fintech firms. And then looking at regulatory and compliance barriers, there's quite a few regulations in the banking industry. It's a highly regulated industry for a good reason. Basel III and the Frank-Dodd Act, both are measures that came post-2008, and they really increased oversight and capital requirements for banking. SR 11.7 is also a risk management guideline that provides guidelines around risk and risk when it comes to quantitative models in decision making. And so that goes for just not only past underwriting but current underwriting. When banks start to implement AI into their underwriting technologies, then they're going to have to be careful about how that's affecting regulatory compliance. And overall, regulation is going to always lag technology. So even though we have regulations today, there's still quite a few regulations, and it's a very gray area as far as some of that compliance. And so it's important that banks are able to grow without necessarily, with taking into account regulations as well. And then finally, some ethical considerations. First of all, privacy. Alternative data information is very sensitive. It's important to know who has access to it, where is this data coming from, as well as transparency being really important. So are banks understanding truly how these models are working and how they're integrating the data in, and will consumers know why they were denied? And finally, bias kind of ties into that transparency again. Are communities or actions targeted, and is everyone being treated equally? So what is the future outlook for regional banks? Firstly, there's going to be increased performance gaps. So banks that are investing heavily in digital capabilities are going to be able to see more efficiency and more growth, and those that don't are going to fall behind. That also ties into technology investment being inevitable as we move forward in society. It's a digital age. Technology is very important, and it's only going to become more and more necessary for banks to keep competing. Third, relationship banking will evolve. In regional banking and banking in general, relationships are very important, and it's important that regional banks are able to stick to this relationship banking model and use alternative data as a way to supplement this and as a way to communicate with those that are with their clients and ensure that they're able to help them to the best of their abilities. And then finally, access to credit will expand for the underserved. So for many communities that aren't able to access credit right now, hopefully through alternative data, we'll be able to see how this information can increase the amount of people who are able to be served by banks, because that's really one of the big purposes of banks, is to help the community. And so hopefully with alternative data, we'll be able to do this. And then looking at strategic pathways for success, first, modernized technology and fintech partnerships. Regions Bank, for example, just partnered with Self Financial, and they provide credit building services like reporting different data points like utility payments to credit bureaus, and that helps people to really build up their credit. And so if a bank can't afford or is facing those regulatory issues when it comes to modernizing technology, then partnering with fintech firms could be a more cost-effective way to cash in on this technology and to keep on growing as a regional bank. Secondly, improving underwriting models. Like I said before, it's very expensive to take on that new technology and AI and alternative data. And so maybe presenting hybrid underwriting models that still work with core legacy systems or with current underwriting and incorporating in alternative data could be a way that's more cost efficient as well and allows for them to still stay competitive. And then third, responsible implementation and governance. It's important that regulations are being followed and that firms are making decisions as a team and they're understanding what's at stake in this. Of course, it's very important to strengthen that trust with clients and also build those relationships even as they take on new information that could be sensitive or private. And so to conclude, alternative data presents a really major opportunity for banks. It can help to improve underwriting accuracy, expand that access to credit, and and also strengthen relationships, which is where regional banks really have their stronghold. So it can help to create a competitive edge. Regional banks are under significant pressure currently, and alternative data should be used as a way to strengthen but not replace that relationship-driven model that regional banks support. Yeah, that's what I have. Thank you. If anyone has any questions too.
Go ahead. Before we bring up David's mentor, let's go ahead and start with questions.
Yep.
What do you think is like the single most important thing that's going to like influence like a change in the banking industry, like with alternative data, like especially for people who are like working in banking now that aren't as familiar with technology and like the older generation? What do you think will be important?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I think the regulatory measures are probably the most important aspect of that. Like I said before, it's still a very gray area when it comes to regulations. Obviously, banking is already highly regulated, but when it comes to AI, alternative data, and that technology, it's not an area, it's grown so fast in just the past few years that's an area that people are really going to need to consider when they're looking at, growing their technology and changing the way that banks are going to focus on digitalization and overall working with the clients and customers. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Really easy for you, but I don't know what fintech is.
Oh yeah, fintech. These are like financial technology companies. They see fast growth. A lot of them are not considered banks. There's a whole bunch within the financial services sector, but a lot of them they loan. They can work as a bank in the sense that they're loaning, but their main priority is growing that technology capabilities and being very current with with changes and whatnot. And so they incorporate highly like technological aspects into their financial services.
So they can kind of complement banking services.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Any other questions? Okay, so we introduce his mentor, Dr. Kathleen Wilburn, who will bestow upon him.
Now, I will tell you that this experience as his mentor meant hours and hours and hours of learning on my part. Because as his ideas and everything, I'm out there studying and everything else so we can have this. So anyway, I want to thank him for the fact that I learned much more than I normally do from this process. So thank you very much. Let's get this right.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.